I should have seen it coming, but the truth is, no one ever does. Not when the knife is sharpened by the hands you once held in your own. I remember the cold snap in the air that evening, how the lights of Seattle sparkled like a million little lies outside the tall glass windows of the viewpoint. I'd chosen the place for the view, for the way the city stretched beneath us, for the feeling that I was finally, at the summit after all these years. It was supposed to be a celebration, a marking of time. I just closed the deal. $45 million for a company I'd built out of a basement in Dorchester. Sweat and grit packed into every line of code. Every contract signed with calloused hands. My son Evan had flown out from Chicago with Rachel. They'd insisted on coming. "Dad, we have to toast to this," Evan had said, his voice carrying that blend of enthusiasm and calculation I'd learned to watch for. We took the elevator up together, Evan with his arm draped around Rachel radiating her usual poise in a midnight blue dress, her smile bright and sharp enough to cut glass. The maitre d' welcomed us by name. Our table was waiting by the window, champagne already chilling, the city glittering behind us. Rachel ordered for the table. She always did. Then looked at me, her eyes expectant, as if she was waiting for a punchline. It was a scene meant for a magazine cover. All soft music and candlelight and perfect surfaces. But beneath it, the tension vibrated like a live wire. Evan tapped his glass, and Rachel flashed that grin again. "To the man who never quit," she said. Her voice pitched just right for the other diners to overhear. The waiter poured. I lifted my glass, felt the familiar warmth of pride and exhaustion blooming in my chest. Evan's eyes met mine over the rim, and for a moment, I saw the boy I used to take fishing out on Lake Chelan. The one who'd ask 1,000 questions about the world. That boy was gone, replaced by someone older, sharper, who wore his ambitions like a second skin. The first course arrived. Rachel talked about their plans for a new condo near Lincoln Park. Evan started on about an investment project, and I listened, nodding, smiling in the right places, while a strange pressure built up behind my ribs. This was what we'd all become. Actors in an expensive play, pretending we were closer than we really were. Then it happened. Not with a bang, but a whisper. The security guard, a stocky man with a trimmed beard and tired eyes, approached our table as I finished my orange juice, leaned in low and murmured, "Sir, I just saw your son slip something into your drink." My heart didn't just drop. It fell straight out of my chest, left a hollow that filled with ice and panic. I looked at Evan, at the son who'd once fallen asleep on my chest during thunderstorms, who'd borrowed my old Chevy for prom, and saw nothing but a stranger, all practiced innocence and careful distance. Rachel reached for the bread basket, unaware. Or maybe not. My hand trembled. I steadied it against the tablecloth, forced a thin smile, mind spinning as the guard melted back into the crowd. I stared at my glass. Was this real? Was I imagining it? I tried to tell myself there was a mistake, some confusion, that surely this was impossible. But the look in the guard's eyes had held no doubt. A chill raced up my spine. I replayed every word, every glance between Evan and Rachel, the way Rachel had nudged the juice closer to me, the way Evan's eyes had flicked away, just for a second, as if he couldn't quite watch. Years collapsed in on themselves. Memories. Baseball games, science fairs, scraped knees, late-night talks about nothing and everything. All of it washed away in that instant. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. I reached for my heart meds, pretending a mild headache, and, in a motion so subtle I surprised myself, poured a small amount of juice into the empty pill bottle I always carried. An old habit from the days when stress meant pain in my chest, not poison in my drink. The rest, I spilled onto my napkin, dabbing at an imaginary stain, the citrus soaking into fine linen. The whole time, I kept talking, kept listening, kept pretending nothing was wrong. Every second was agony. Was I about to die, right here, in front of my son and his wife, in a room full of strangers who'd only remember a headline? Tech founder collapses at landmark restaurant? Was Evan waiting for me to fall? My skin crawled at the thought. I felt stripped bare, every secret between us suddenly a weapon. Every shared history now ammunition in a private war I never even knew had started. The rest of the night played out in slow motion. I excused myself to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stared at my reflection, the lines around my eyes, the gray at my temples. I tried to steady my breathing, told myself to focus. I capped the pill bottle, slid it into my jacket pocket, and called my lawyer, the one I trusted with everything. Voicemail. "We need to talk," I whispered. "Emergency. Call me back. Now." Back at the table, the world spun on as if nothing had happened. Rachel ordered dessert. Evan laughed too loudly at a joke I barely heard. My own voice sounded far away, coming from someone else's mouth. I glanced at the city below. Cars, lights, life going on, oblivious to the fact that everything I thought I knew had just come undone. How many times had I missed the signs? The way Evan's calls had become less frequent, the way he'd started talking more about legacy and less about love. Rachel's gentle pressure, always about the future, always about making sure the family's protected. All of it clicking into place too late. After the check was paid, I stood and hugged them both, felt Evan tense under my arm. "You all right, Dad?" he asked, eyes flicking sideways. "Just tired," I said, and it was true. Bone tired, soul tired. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said, and for a second, I wanted to believe him, to believe it was all some horrible misunderstanding. But the guard's voice echoed in my mind. I shook Rachel's hand. Her skin was cold, her nails digging ever so slightly into my palm. As I walked away, I felt 100 eyes on me, the story not yet written but already headed for disaster. I stepped out into the Seattle night, the air sharp and briny off the sound. My legs nearly gave out, but I kept walking, driven by something older and deeper than fear. A need to understand, to survive, to somehow make sense of the impossible. I turned the pill bottle in my pocket. Evidence. Proof. Betrayal made solid, real, cold in my hand. The world around me pulsed with a strange clarity. For the first time in my life, I didn't know who my family was. But I knew who I was, and I knew what I had to do. I didn't go home that night. I walked for hours through Pioneer Square, past tourists and couples and street musicians, past all the lives that would keep spinning regardless of what happened to mine. I watched the ferries crossing Elliott Bay, the neon flicker of signs reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. Everything so alive and vivid it hurt. My phone buzzed. Evan calling. I let it ring. I sat on a bench near the market, listening to the city breathe, feeling the weight of my own heartbeat. Every thump a question with no easy answer. How do you prepare for war with your own blood? How do you mourn the living? Long after midnight, I finally hailed a cab. The driver didn't ask questions. I gave him my lawyer's address, watching the city fade in the rearview, my mind racing through contingency plans, memories, what-ifs and if-onlys. I was already mourning the loss, even as I mapped out my next move. I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. I also knew that I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Something inside me hardened, a core of steel I'd forgotten I still possessed. I made a promise to myself, right then and there. I would find the truth no matter what it cost. I would not be anyone's victim, not even my son's. And whatever story was about to unfold, it would be mine to write, beginning to end. If you'd asked me 10 years ago what the word legacy meant, I would have pointed at my son and said his name without hesitation. I would have told you about the years I spent grinding away, long nights with code and cold pizza, and the promises I made to myself while staring at a cheap ceiling in some basement in Dorchester. It was easy to believe back then that all that work, all those sacrifices, would become a golden ladder for my family, lifting us out of old ghosts and into something permanent, something better. I used to think that a man's duty was to provide, and that was enough. But the night in Seattle changed everything. Suddenly, the years seemed smaller, almost weightless compared to the cold certainty that had settled in my bones. My mind circled back, unwillingly, over the broken ground of memory, searching for where things had started to go wrong, and when the lines between love and responsibility had blurred beyond repair. I saw myself again, a much younger man, hunched over a desk with more bills than dollars in my pocket. Sarah asleep on the couch behind me, her nursing scrubs tossed over a kitchen chair. Those years were a grind of dreams and desperation. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough to keep the lights on, enough to cover Evan's little league fees, enough to buy ice cream on Sundays when Sarah could get away from the hospital. I remembered thinking if I just worked a little harder, we could buy a house in a good neighborhood, send Evan to a better school, maybe even take a vacation that didn't involve visiting relatives in New Hampshire. Every time I missed a bedtime story or showed up late to a parent-teacher conference, I told myself it was for him, for all of us. The guilt was easy to bury under spreadsheets and deadlines. Sarah would kiss me on the cheek, tired but patient, and tell me I was building something important. When the company finally started making money, it felt like stepping into a new world. Suddenly, we could afford new clothes, a bigger house, the kind of Christmases Sarah used to dream about as a kid. Evan went from a shy kid in hand-me-downs to a confident teenager who never worried about money, who never knew what it meant to go without. I tried to teach him about hard work, tried to show him that nothing in this world comes for free. But the more I provided, the less he seemed to notice the cost. I was proud of him when he got into Northwestern, proud when he started his own projects, even if he rarely finished them. When he met Rachel, it felt like a second wind. She was smart, driven, with the kind of social confidence I'd never had. She took charge of every situation, organizing Evan's life with a precision that almost impressed me. Looking back, there were signs I didn't want to see. The way Rachel talked about the future, always in numbers and property lines, always making sure she was included in every conversation about the family business. She was warm when she needed to be, cool and distant when she didn't. Evan seemed to orbit around her, pulled by a gravity I didn't quite understand. At first, I thought they balanced each other out, that Rachel's ambition would help Evan find his own. But there were cracks, tiny at first. Missed phone calls, unreturned texts, growing silences during family dinners. I told myself they were just busy, caught up in the tidal pull of their own lives. But some part of me felt the distance growing wider every year. After Sarah passed, the house felt too big, every room echoing with memories. Evan visited less, always with an excuse about work or travel or, Rachel needs me here. I tried to fill the space with work, more projects, more late nights, but the silence was different. I was no longer building for a future, just running from the past. Evan called only when he needed something, advice about a job, money for a new investment, help with a down payment on their condo. I always said yes, telling myself that was what fathers did. Rachel's voice, soft but firm, often came through the background of those calls, suggesting what Evan should ask for. Always polite, always controlled. When I look back at those years now, I can see how I traded time for money, presence for provision, love for duty. I missed birthdays and graduations, spent more time in hotel lobbies and airports than in Evan's world. I kept telling myself there would be time to fix it all later. I watched as Evan grew into a man I barely recognized. Restless, ambitious, but never quite satisfied, never quite finished with anything he started. Rachel was always there, moving pieces around on the chessboard, making sure the family's image was spotless. She was the one who pushed for the trust fund, for the legal documents, for the meetings with accountants. When I tried to talk to Evan alone, Rachel always seemed to find a way to join the conversation, guiding it back to practicalities, to the bottom line. I think about the last Thanksgiving we all spent together. The house was full of laughter and noise, but underneath it all was a tension I couldn't name. Evan spent most of the evening checking his phone, Rachel chatting with my lawyer about the best way to manage family assets. I carved the turkey, watched my son and his wife build a life that seemed more about appearances than connection. I wanted to say something, to break the pattern, but the words caught in my throat. After dessert, Rachel took me aside, told me Evan had been feeling stressed, that maybe I could give him more space in the company, maybe start thinking about succession. She smiled, called me Dad, but it sounded like a closing argument. Even after everything, I held on to the belief that family could weather anything. I kept waiting for Evan to come back, to find his way. I told myself that once the sale was finalized, once the money was in the bank, we could finally relax, finally reconnect. I pictured long dinners, holidays at Lake Chelan, maybe even a fishing trip like we used to take when he was small. But that night in Seattle ripped the blinders from my eyes. In a single whisper, years of faith and denial came crashing down. I realized I'd built my whole life around the idea that sacrifice guaranteed love, that giving everything would protect us from the worst. I hadn't protected anything. I just paved the way for a different kind of emptiness. Walking through my memories, I see Evan at every age, chubby-cheeked and laughing as I lifted him into the air, sullen and silent after a teenage argument, awkward and hopeful on his wedding day. I see the gaps, the moments I let slip by because I was too busy, too tired, too sure there'd be more time. I remember the look on Sarah's face the last time we spoke, the way she squeezed my hand and told me, "Don't forget, Jack. Family is more than what you leave behind." I nodded then, thinking I understood. But now her words ring in my ears like a warning I never truly heard. There's a part of me that wants to blame Evan, to point at Rachel, to say it was their greed, their impatience, their sense of entitlement that poisoned everything. But the truth is more complicated. I see now how each of us played our part, how the chase for security and legacy became a race no one could win. Evan learned from my example that money fixed everything, that hard work was the only currency worth having. Rachel learned to measure her value by what she could acquire, how much control she could wield. And I learned too late that you can't buy trust, can't negotiate loyalty, can't outwork a broken heart. Sitting in that dark taxi after the dinner, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Sarah smiling in the sunlight, Evan with a birthday cake, our old house in winter, the car we drove across the country when I first got the job that started it all. Each image was a piece of the puzzle, fragments of a story that felt like someone else's life. I wondered if Evan remembered any of it, if he ever thought about the late-night conversations we used to have, the promise I made that he'd never have to worry about anything. Maybe I protected him too much, made things too easy, erased every consequence until nothing felt real. As the city faded behind me, I felt a grief that went deeper than anger, a sense of loss that had nothing to do with money or betrayal or even death. I mourned the family I thought I had, the man I thought I'd raised, the love I thought could outlast the failures. I knew I couldn't go back, couldn't fix the past, but I also knew I wasn't done fighting for what mattered. Maybe I'd lost my son to ambition, to resentment, to the invisible scars of my own mistakes. But there was still something left to salvage, some truth worth uncovering, even if it cost me everything I'd worked for. I spent the rest of that night writing a letter to Sarah, the kind I used to leave for her on the kitchen table when I came home too late to say goodnight. I told her about the deal, about the night at the viewpoint, about the choice Evan had made. I asked for her forgiveness, for the ways I'd failed, for the blind spots I never saw. I promised I would find a way to set things right, that I wouldn't let our story end in bitterness and regret. When I finished, I folded the letter and slipped it into her old recipe box, the one she left behind with her handwritten notes and shopping lists. It wasn't enough, but it was something. That was the night I stopped running from the truth. I finally understood what Sarah meant, that family is what you fight for, what you risk, what you forgive, that sometimes the only way forward is through the wreckage, not around it. The next morning, I woke up to a city washed clean by rain, the sky the color of old steel. I poured myself a cup of coffee, stared at the evidence in my jacket pocket, and felt something shift inside me. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide what kind of man I would be when the storm finally broke. Morning arrived gray and silent, the city muffled by a heavy marine layer rolling in from the sound. I stood at my kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, eyes fixed on nothing and everything. I'd been awake most of the night, replaying the dinner at Viewpoint like a film stuck on a single ruinous scene. The sense of betrayal didn't lessen with daylight. It sharpened. If anything, dawn only made it clearer. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no way back to the world I thought I'd built. There was only what happened next. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my phone. My hands were steadier now, purpose carving away at the confusion and pain. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for a name I hadn't called in years. Roger Sue, a lab technician who owed me a favor from the days when I'd helped his son get an internship at my company. It took 3 rings before he answered, groggy but polite. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I needed a toxicology screen. Private, quick, no questions. I didn't mention why. He heard it in my voice. Bring it by, he said. I'll stay late. The pill bottle felt heavy in my pocket. Heavier than a small plastic cylinder had any right to be. The drive across Seattle was a blur. The rain started in fits, washing away old leaves and pushing pedestrians beneath awnings and bus shelters. I watched the city through the windshield, my mind turning over every detail of the night before. My son's eyes, his nervous glances, the careful choreography of Rachel's words, the way she steered the conversation, the guard's low voice in my ear. It all came together in a latticework of dread. I'd spent a lifetime solving puzzles, market problems, software glitches, broken contracts. But nothing in my life had prepared me for the puzzle of my own family's intent. Roger took the sample with a wordless nod and a promise to call by noon. I waited at a coffee shop down the street, barely touching my bagel, feeling time stretch and contract in ways I couldn't control. Every person who walked in looked like they might know something, might be watching. My mind ran wild, sketching out every possible outcome, every conversation I might need to have with police, with lawyers, with Evan himself. I tried to imagine what Sarah would have said, what advice she would have given. She'd always had a way of seeing the truth behind words, of spotting the fault lines beneath a calm surface. I missed her so fiercely in that moment, the ache so sharp it nearly took my breath away. The call came just after 11. Roger didn't waste time on preamble. Cyanide, he said. A lethal dose, confirmed by 2 separate tests. I thanked him and hung up, the world shrinking down to a pinpoint of clarity. I sat in silence for a long while, watching rain streak the windows, then called my attorney, Marianne. I didn't tell her the whole story, only that I needed to change my will. Everything out of the ordinary was a red flag, but Marianne had known me long enough not to ask too many questions. I scheduled the meeting for that afternoon. There was no time for regret or hesitation. Back home, I sat at the dining table with a yellow legal pad, jotting out what needed to be done. I listed every account, every asset, every insurance policy. My signature had once been the only key to my company's vault. Now I needed to make sure it was a dead end for anyone but myself. I wrote the names of charities I'd admired for years but never given enough to. Seattle Children's, the homeless shelter down on Yesler, a scholarship in Sarah's name at her old nursing school. I felt a strange calm descend, a clarity born of heartbreak. If Evan and Rachel wanted the fruits of my labor, they would get none of it. I would cut them out of the story entirely. I combed through months of bank statements and credit card bills, hunting for clues I'd overlooked. There were odd withdrawals, Evan wiring money to an online betting site, cash advances that made no sense. I scrolled through his social media, finding hints of a life lived in debt and denial, of risks taken for the thrill rather than the gain. I noticed how Rachel always posted photos of their vacations, their luxury dinners, their endless celebrations. She tagged me in less and less, as if erasing me in plain sight. One picture stuck out. Evan with an unfamiliar man at a bar in Vegas, Rachel's hand tight on his shoulder, both of them smiling too broadly. The caption read, "Winning big, dreaming bigger." I felt sick. There were more signs, all hiding in plain sight. Email threads where Rachel urged Evan to ask for advances on his trust fund. Cryptic messages about getting things sorted before Dad makes up his mind. It was all there, the evidence of slow, creeping betrayal. I'd raised a son who saw me not as a father, but as a hurdle, a wife who saw my life's work as something to be liquidated. It was almost funny in a bitter, cosmic sense. I'd spent my life protecting them from the world, only to discover I'd failed to protect myself from them. I found the old manila envelope with the original trust documents. My hands shook as I read the language. If I died, Evan inherited everything, every share, every account, every asset. I remembered signing those papers, full of pride and hope, telling Sarah, "This will give him a head start, just in case." Just in case what? I asked myself. just in case my own child decided I was worth more dead than alive? The thought chilled me to the bone. Marianne's office was all glass and steel, overlooking Puget Sound, the kind of place that makes you believe order can be imposed on chaos. She listened as I laid out the changes, never asking for details she didn't need to know. I told her to amend the will. Evan and Rachel were out. The money would go to a set of charities, and the house would be donated as a transitional home for families leaving the foster system. I left nothing to chance, spelling out every clause, every condition. Marian nodded, her pen flying across the pages. She watched me carefully, as if weighing how much pain one man could hold without breaking. I signed the new documents with a hand steadier than I felt. The rest of the day passed in a fog of logistics and finalities. I canceled the family trust's automatic payouts, transferred my business accounts to new management, and set up security alerts for all major transactions. I left nothing untouched. Every old password changed, every lock metaphorical and literal replaced. I called a private investigator, Tom Larkin, and told him I needed to know everything about my son's last 6 months. Financials, contacts, travel. I didn't care about the cost. As I sat at my desk, dusk pressing at the windows, I scrolled through old voicemails from Evan. There were dozens, all requests for something: money, advice, a place to stay during a rough patch. I listened to the last one, his voice slurred with drink, telling me he'd make me proud someday. The words echoed, hollow and small, in the empty room. I thought about calling him, about giving him one last chance to explain, to tell me it was all a mistake. But the images in my head were too clear, the facts too cold. I could see Rachel's fingerprints all over the plan, but Evan was no child. He'd made his choices. If there was guilt, he wore it lightly, like a suit borrowed for a single evening. Late that night, I pulled out a photo album Sarah had made for our 30th anniversary. Pages and pages of a life that felt at once foreign and achingly close. Evan as a toddler in Boston Commons, Sarah holding him up as he reached for the carousel. All three of us at his high school graduation, beaming for a future that none of us understood. I closed the album and pressed my forehead to its worn leather cover, the tears finally coming. Not for the money, not even for the betrayal, but for the loss of something I'd never be able to get back. After a long time, I got up, poured a glass of bourbon, and wrote out a list of what I needed to do next. I would not confront them, not yet. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken, or scared, or angry. I would gather evidence, prepare every contingency, make sure that when the truth came out, it would be undeniable. I set the list on my nightstand, turned off the light, and lay awake for hours, the city humming outside, my world reduced to a single, burning point of purpose. The next morning brought a calm I hadn't felt in years. There was pain, yes, but beneath it was something harder, resolve, and an old, familiar sense of control. I moved through my routines like a man preparing for battle. The betrayal was a wound, but it was also a lesson, a final, brutal education. I thought about Sarah, about what she would want for me, and for the man Evan still might be, somewhere under all that resentment and hunger. But for now, I could only move forward, step by step, until I understood the full measure of what I had lost, and what I was willing to do to protect whatever was left. There is a moment, after grief but before rage, where your mind sharpens like a blade. I found myself living in that narrow space, the world around me humming with attention only I could hear. My movements became careful, deliberate, measured with the weight of a man who knows his next steps are not just his own but echo through every decision, every word, every heartbeat. In the days that followed the toxicology report, I moved quietly, keeping my routines, but beneath the surface, everything was different. The betrayal had become a quiet fire in my chest, burning away every last remnant of denial. There was no more pretending, no more hoping for a confession or a moment of clarity from Evan or Rachel. I knew what I had to do. I was no longer interested in explanations or apologies. I wanted the truth in daylight, the facts laid bare, and I wanted it done in a way that left nothing to chance. I started with the investigator. Tom Larkin had a way of fading into the background, the sort of man you'd never notice unless you were looking for him. He came to my house late in the afternoon, his presence calm and unhurried. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the space where birthdays and anniversaries had once been celebrated, now a command center for quiet war. I gave him everything I had: emails, phone logs, photographs, printouts of Evan's financial transactions, Rachel's frequent calls to an unlisted number in Nevada. I watched Tom's eyes flick across the evidence, his mind piecing it together like a puzzle he'd solved before. He nodded, his voice low, and promised a full report within a week. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief, the sense that, for once, I was not alone in carrying the burden. While Tom worked, I began to prepare my own endgame. I spent hours with Marianne, my attorney, reviewing every clause in my new will, double-checking that nothing could be challenged or undone. I sat with the accountants, spelling out my wishes for every dollar, every asset, every piece of what had once been a family legacy. No loophole, no technicality, nothing left to interpretation. The money would go to charity, to real people who would never know my name. Evan and Rachel would get nothing but the consequences of their choices. But there was one thing left to do, something no lawyer or investigator could manage. I needed to face them, not with anger or violence or tears, but with the facts, with the evidence, with the simple truth laid bare. I knew they wouldn't confess, not unless forced into a corner with no way out. So I decided to give them one final dinner, one last opportunity to tell me the truth, or to dig their own graves deeper with every word. I called them both on a Thursday morning, my voice steady and warm. I told them I wanted to celebrate the closing of the sale, to talk about the future, to come together as a family again. Rachel accepted immediately, her tone bright with forced enthusiasm, while Evan hesitated just a second too long before agreeing. I made a reservation at the viewpoint, the same table by the window, the same city lights gleaming below us. I arranged for Tom to be nearby, not as a threat, but as a witness, a silent sentinel to what would unfold. That evening, I dressed carefully, choosing a suit I hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral, dark and sober, with a tie she had once given me for good luck. The act of dressing felt ceremonial, like donning armor. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not just the lines of age and worry, but the resolve that had carried me through every hardship, every risk, every impossible choice. I was not here to beg for understanding. I was here for justice. The dinner began with all the trappings of a family gathering: small talk, polite laughter, the kind of careful choreography that comes from years of learned performance. Evan picked at his meal, his appetite gone, while Rachel steered the conversation with gentle but insistent questions about my plans, my travels, the sale. I answered them all, never once letting my guard down, watching for any crack in their facade. Halfway through the meal, I asked the waiter to bring over the potted plant from our last dinner, the one I had poured the poison juice into. It sat now in the center of the table, leaves brown and brittle, the silent witness to their crime. Rachel's eyes flicked to it, her smile faltering for just a moment, while Evan went still, his hand frozen above his fork. I let the silence stretch, then spoke quietly, my voice steady and clear. I told them what the lab had found. I told them about the emails, the bank records, the changed will. I told them I knew everything. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the clink of a fork against a plate, the murmur of other diners in the distance. Rachel was the first to speak, her words careful, calculated, an attempt to turn the accusation into misunderstanding, to cast doubt on the evidence. Evan just stared at the table, his knuckles white, breathing shallow and fast. I listened to them both, heard every excuse, every lie, every desperate bid for innocence. But there was nothing left to say. I pushed a manila envelope across the table, thick with the weight of my investigation. Inside were the photos, the statements, the full report from Tom. I told them to read it, to understand what they had done. I told them that everything was already with my attorney, that the police could be called at any moment. Rachel's mask cracked, her voice rising in a pitch I had never heard before, while Evan looked at me with a mixture of hatred and shame I wouldn't wish on any father. In that moment, the reality of what they had done became inescapable. There was no more family, no more pretending. just the cold, clear air between us, and the knowledge that this was the end of something that had once been beautiful. I watched Evan crumble, his shoulders shaking, his voice breaking as he tried to explain, to blame the debts, the pressure, the years of feeling like he could never measure up. Rachel, too, tried to turn the blame on me, accusing me of caring more about money than people, of being absent, of building walls instead of bridges. I listened to it all, the truth and the lies, the pain and the fear, and felt the last of my anger drain away, replaced by a deep and unmovable sadness. But even in that sadness, there was a measure of relief. I had done what I needed to do. I had faced them, told the truth, and given them one last chance to be honest. They had failed, but I had not. I had chosen justice, not revenge. I stood up, gathered my things, and told them quietly that they would never see another dime, never inherit so much as a photograph or a memory. I told them the charities that would benefit from my life's work, the children who would go to college, the families who would have a roof over their heads, all because of the choices they had made. As I walked out of the restaurant, past the other diners and the staff who had watched the evening unfold, I felt strangely light, almost free. The betrayal was still there, sharp and unyielding, but it no longer owned me. I had reclaimed my story, my legacy, my peace. I stepped out into the cool night, the city alive around me, and for the first time in years, I felt the future opening up ahead of me. Not as a curse, but as a gift. When you finally see your life for what it is, stripped bare of hope, stripped bare of illusion, there is no grand gesture, no dramatic crescendo. There is only the sound of your own heart beating, steady and stubborn, refusing to give up even as the world you built collapses quietly around you. The days after that last dinner at the Viewpoint passed in a strange, slow-motion haze. The air felt different, thinner somehow, every breath a reminder that there was no going back. I carried myself through the routines of daily life, groceries, calls from my attorney, paperwork with the accountants, like a man visiting the ruins of his own history. Everything was familiar but drained of meaning, as if each room in my house held a faded afterimage of who I used to be. I started to see the past for what it was, and not what I'd wanted it to be. I heard Sarah's laughter in the kitchen, the clink of her wedding ring against a coffee mug, the soft hum of her voice as she read late into the night. I saw Evan's childhood scattered through every room, model rockets on the bookshelves, a framed jersey from his high school baseball team, old report cards yellowing in a file cabinet. Those artifacts, once proof of a family's love and endurance, now felt like souvenirs from another man's life. They were things I had held onto out of duty, out of hope. Now, as I boxed them up for charity or the landfill, I realized I was letting go of more than memories. I was letting go of a story that no longer belonged to me. The day came for the final signing of the new will. Marion met me at her office with the gravity of a surgeon. Every page precisely prepared, every signature a small death. I sat in her glass-walled conference room and watched my own hand as I wrote my name, the same name that had appeared on every check, every contract, every loan that brought my family out of poverty and into comfort. I felt the weight of Sarah's absence, the empty seat beside me as sharp as a wound. The paperwork was finished in minutes. The old will, the one that left everything to Evan, was shredded before my eyes. I felt no triumph, only an immense, unmovable sadness. Afterward, I walked along the waterfront, the wind off Elliott Bay raw against my face. I thought about the nature of forgiveness, about whether any of us really deserve it. I thought about Evan and Rachel, wondered where they were at that moment, what stories they would tell themselves to make sense of what they'd done. Maybe, in some distant future, they would find each other in the same house, still searching for someone else to blame. Maybe they would never speak again, united only by the memory of what they lost. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote the letter that would serve as my last word to them. I kept it brief, not out of anger but because there was nothing left to say. I told them that the money was gone, that the trust was dissolved, that every dollar would go to strangers who might still believe in kindness. I told them I hoped they found something real to hold on to, something no one could steal or poison. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't offer forgiveness. I signed my name and sealed the envelope, knowing it would be opened with trembling hands. A week passed in silence, broken only by routine calls and the distant sound of construction outside my window. I spent my days going through the motions of winding down a life. Closing accounts, canceling subscriptions, donating boxes of old clothes and books. I called Sarah's sister in Massachusetts, asked her to come collect the things that mattered, the ones I couldn't bear to throw away. She understood, her voice gentle, promising to keep the family history safe. The email from Evan arrived one morning as I was packing up the last of my personal effects from the office. The subject line was simply Dad. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, half expecting another plea, another excuse. Instead, it was a confession, raw and unfinished, words pouring out in jagged sentences. He wrote about the debts, the pressure, the shame of never measuring up, the years of trying to please me and failing. He said he hated what he'd become, that he blamed Rachel, blamed himself, blamed the world. He asked if I could ever forgive him. He told me he was sorry, that he wished things had been different. I sat for a long time before responding. I tried to remember the boy he had been, the boy who loved building things with his hands, who cried when he thought he disappointed me. I wanted to say something wise, something that would ease the ache in both our hearts. In the end, I wrote only that I hoped he would find peace, that forgiveness was not a gift to be granted but a journey he would have to make on his own. I told him I would always love him, in the way a man loves the idea of what might have been. Rachel never wrote. I wondered what story she would tell, what truths she would hide from herself to make the days go by. Maybe she would start over somewhere new, find another man with a legacy worth coveting, another life to slip into. Or maybe she would remember the night at the viewpoint for what it was. The end of one story, the beginning of another, written in the currency of loss. As the final days in my old home ticked away, I found myself drawn to small acts of kindness. I volunteered at the food bank, taught coding to kids at the local community center, donated blood for the first time in decades. There was a strange comfort in being useful again, in giving without expectation or attachment. The world kept spinning. The city kept breathing. I was no longer a man at war with his own history, just another soul trying to make sense of the spaces love used to fill. One afternoon, I drove out to Lake Chelan, the place Sarah had always wanted to retire. I rented a small cabin on the shore, packed a few boxes of clothes, and left the rest behind. The drive took half a day, winding through forests and across mountain passes, the radio playing songs from another lifetime. When I arrived, I stood on the deck and watched the sun set over the water, the sky streaked with pink and gold. I felt something inside me loosen, the old bitterness draining away with the last light of day. That night, I wrote an email to my former employees, thanking them for their loyalty, their work, the years we had built something together. I told them the company was in good hands, that I was proud of every one of them. I ended with a simple message: take care of each other. You're more than what you build. The next morning, a letter arrived from the hospital. The donation had gone through. The children's wing would be named after Sarah. A small kindness paid forward into a future I would never see. I wept as I read the letter, not for what I had lost, but for the goodness that might grow in the places we leave behind. On the final day before leaving Seattle, I stood in the empty house, my footsteps echoing off the bare walls. I imagined Sarah's laughter, Evan's tiny hands tugging at my sleeve, the music of ordinary life before it was drowned out by ambition and regret. I whispered a goodbye to the past, knowing I would never return. There are things that cannot be undone, betrayals that cut too deep for words. But even so, life finds a way to go on. The pain dulls, the wounds scar over, and if you're lucky, you find meaning in the fragments. I left the city with nothing but my own name, a battered heart, and the knowledge that I had done what I could to make things right. The rest I left to time. I used to believe that freedom was something you could earn, a reward for sacrifice, a door that would finally open if you worked hard enough, waited long enough, paid the price in silence. But after everything, the betrayals, the funerals, the empty rooms, I've learned that real freedom comes quietly, without applause, and rarely in the way you expect. It arrived for me not as a triumphant finish line, but as a slow unraveling, a shedding of old skins and old certainties, until all that was left was the truth and the trembling hope for peace. Lake Chelan in spring is both breathtaking and merciless. The water stays cold, mountain-fed, but the air grows softer each day, the sun glinting off the surface like scattered coins. My cabin is small but sturdy, built decades ago for fishermen who wanted nothing but quiet. Here, time moves differently. There are no company calls, no lawyers, no hollow dinners with forced laughter and broken promises. I walk the shoreline at dawn, the stones sharp beneath my feet, and for the first time in years, my mind feels still. Some nights I wake in darkness, heart pounding, expecting Rachel's icy voice or Evan's urgent pleas, but it is only the hush of wind through the pines, the soft lap of water against the dock. I'm alone, truly alone, and sometimes the relief is almost painful. At first, I thought the loneliness would be unbearable, that the absence of family would eat away at me like a slow rot. I spent the first weeks rearranging furniture, trying to fill the silence with tasks. I sorted through Sarah's old recipe cards, reading her looping handwriting, the notes she left in margins, reminders to add more cinnamon, jokes about burning toast. I found her wedding ring in a small velvet pouch, and I wore it on a chain around my neck, needing the weight of her memory to anchor me. I still talk to her sometimes in the early hours before sunrise, telling her about the lake, about the children who will be helped by her name, about the man I've become, ashamed and proud in equal measure. Slowly, the pain softened. I began to build new habits. I joined the local library's book club, at first just to have somewhere to be, a place where no one knew my story. I baked bread and gave it to the neighbors, learned their names and the names of their grandchildren. I volunteered at the elementary school, helping third graders with math, seeing in their bright faces a flicker of Evan as a boy, the one I loved so fiercely before time and disappointment made us strangers. There is a healing in these small connections, a way to belong that has nothing to do with legacy or blood. Each month, I receive letters from the hospital, updates on the children's wing named for Sarah. The first time I visited, I was greeted by a mural of handprints, dozens of colors painted by the children who would get a second chance at life. I stood in the hallway and wept openly, surrounded by nurses and doctors who had no idea who I was. It was Sarah's laughter I heard in those halls, the kind that turned sorrow into hope. I sent a thank you note to the director, asked for nothing in return, content to know that something beautiful had grown from my wreckage. On rare days, the past creeps in. A letter from Evan appears in my mailbox, sometimes angry, sometimes full of regret. He writes about trying to rebuild, about missing his mother, about not knowing how to fix what's broken. He asks for nothing, but his words vibrate with longing. I reply only when I have something true to say, refusing to offer forgiveness as a shortcut or a favor. I tell him that healing is work, that sorrow is heavy but not fatal, that love doesn't disappear just because trust is gone. I don't know if he understands. I suspect he's still searching for someone to blame, still lost in the echo of his own choices. But each letter grows softer, less frantic, more honest. It is a beginning, not a solution, and I accept it for what it is. I see Rachel's name sometimes in the news, never directly, always in the margins. She's moved to California, started a consulting business, reinvented herself as an expert in resilience. I wonder if she tells herself the story differently, if she has managed to scrub away the blood from her hands, or if the memory of that night at the viewpoint haunts her as it does me. Sometimes I hope she finds peace. Sometimes I hope she never does. Forgiveness, it turns out, is not a single act but 100 small decisions made in private, each one both mercy and boundary. My days are full now in a way they never were before. I write letters to old friends, reconnect with cousins I had neglected for decades. I plant a garden behind the cabin, rows of tomatoes and peppers and wildflowers for the bees. There is a comfort in the routine, in the promise that something new can grow even in the poorest soil. I find myself laughing more, though sometimes it catches me by surprise. The sound so foreign it feels like another man's voice. The lake has a way of smoothing out the sharp edges, teaching me patience, reminding me that everything changes if you wait long enough. Occasionally, a former employee finds me. They bring stories of new projects, new lives, thank me for the chance to learn, to make mistakes, to build something that mattered. I never tell them the truth behind my retirement. I listen to their stories, cheer for their successes, and wonder what my life might have been if I had learned to let go sooner, if I had believed in the value of my own heart before it was battered by disappointment. There is a woman at the bakery in town, Lydia, who lost her husband the year before. We talk in the early mornings, sharing coffee and silence. Her grief mirrors mine, but hers is gentler, shaped by time and the certainty of love well spent. She shows me how to braid challah, tells me stories of her childhood in rural Idaho, invites me to Sunday dinners where the table is crowded with neighbors and laughter. She never asks about my past. With her, I am just Jack, a man who bakes bread and loves the lake. The simplicity is a gift I never expected, a reminder that even the most shattered lives can be stitched together with kindness. Still, there are nights when the ghosts return. I dream of Evan as a child, his laughter echoing down the hall, his small hand curled around mine. I dream of Sarah, her eyes full of forgiveness I haven't earned. I wake before dawn, sit on the porch wrapped in an old blanket, and let the memories move through me like weather. I do not chase them away. I let them stay, knowing that sorrow is not a punishment but a testament to love. The world is quieter now, but it is no longer empty. One afternoon, a letter arrives from the Scholarship Foundation. The first group of students have graduated. Young men and women who would have been invisible without Sarah's name lighting their path. They send thank you notes, photographs, stories of hope and ambition. I pin them to the wall above my desk, reminders that legacy is not a bank account but a hand reaching out, again and again, to lift someone else. In their faces I see a future untethered to the old, familiar pain. Sometimes, when the lake is still and the sky turns lavender at dusk, I wonder about the meaning of justice, of revenge, of family. Was I right to cut Evan out, to let the past burn rather than risk another wound? Is forgiveness something we owe, or only something we can offer when we are ready? There are no simple answers, no tidy endings. What remains is the stubborn beat of my own heart, and the knowledge that I have survived, changed, scarred, but alive. I think of the men and women who will read this someday, searching for their own solace in the mess of their lives. I hope they understand that the measure of a man is not in what he holds on to, but in what he is willing to release. That justice and mercy are not opposites, but different faces of the same, complicated love. And that sometimes, the only way to find peace is to let go, not of the memory, but of the hunger for what can never be. This is not a story of triumph or of ruin. It is a story of survival, of quiet courage, of starting again when the world says it's too late. I walk the shoreline at dawn, listen to the loons call across the water, and whisper my thanks for every ordinary day. The future is uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I do not fear it. The past is over. The rest is mine to live.